Great. Good evening, comrades and friends of Workers' World Party. Welcome to our weekly broadcast, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the world gather to strategize, analyze, and to build the struggle for a socialist future, a workers' world. Tonight, we have an exciting panel of comrades from Workers' World Party who will be taking on finance capital, especially regarding the Stonksgate phenomenon. A little brief rundown on that situation. Over the last few weeks, there has been a flurry of news coverage and social media discussions surrounding the manipulation of stocks of ailing companies, including GameStop, AMC, and BlackBerry, by members of the subreddit Wall Street Bets. Put briefly, as there are any number of explanations of market principles at play, participants in the effort bought stock in massive quantities in a concerted effort to drive up their prices. And in so doing, created a tidy profit for themselves and hurting the hedge funds short selling those stocks. Short selling, for those unfamiliar, is the practice of borrowing stock from a company and selling it with the intent of buying it back later at a lower price, profiting from the difference. The buyers in this case deliberately created artificial demand for these stocks, meaning that those hedge funds will instead lose money when they buy back the stock, a tactic known as a short squeeze. This campaign has stoked up a lot of grandiose interpretations, with some characterizing it as a wealth redistribution effort and even a working class uprising against Wall Street. While it certainly has benefited some workers, with reports of people paying off their medical, student loan, and other debts with profits they got with an upfront investment of a few $100s or so, that is far from typical. This short squeeze was concocted by people with tens of thousands of dollars of disposable income and was backed by Elon Musk, currently the richest person on the planet. And while at least one hedge fund was bankrupted, BlackRock Incorporated, which owns 13% of GameStop and is valued at $88 billion, stands to gain. Further, small buyers have been encouraged to hold their stock for as long as possible, while the value of the stocks involved has become increasingly volatile due to large-scale buyers selling out prematurely. Inexperienced traders stand to lose while their wealthier counterparts take advantage. Class character aside, this campaign has the potential to reveal to those who are already aware the stock market for the casino that it is. Far from the idealized rational market that tends toward fair prices touted by bourgeois economists, this has demonstrated the inherent manipulability of the stock market and just how much of it is based in pure speculation rather than actual concrete value. This is perhaps most glaringly demonstrated by the move by trading outlets to freeze transactions on the associated stocks, preventing traders from purchasing stock in bulk, if at all, some only allowing positions to be closed out. Most notable among these is Robinhood, a trading app popular among small retail traders because of its low barrier to entry, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, is backed by one of the hedge firms short-selling GameStop stock. Before we get started, please make sure to share this live stream video on Facebook, Twitter, and whatever social media you use, so we can further our reach of this powerful conversation. Want to remind everyone, while most people are watching on Zoom, if you could take a second to go to the Workers' World Party Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/Workers' World Party, and share this live video with your friends and in your Facebook groups and pages. That would help us enormously to reach more members of our class. We also encourage you to share your comments at Workers' World on Twitter. We are also on live tonight on our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/Workers' World Party. So I will now introduce our panelists this evening. First, we have Larry Holmes, Workers' World Party First Secretary, him. Sarah Flounders, who writes for Workers' World and was the editor of the new book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, discussing the impact of COVID-19 on capitalism and the working class, her. We have Martha Gravatt, who is a retired executive board member of United Auto Workers Local 869 and a managing editor of Workers' World newspaper. And we have Nate Chase, who is a member of Workers' World Party and the United National Anti-War Coalition and Youth Against Empire. So if all panelists could turn on their cameras if they haven't already, we'll get started with the questions. So our first pre-prepared question we'll address to Nate. What should revolutionaries learn from the record highs in the stock market? What about this GameStop and other speculative events? How is this a barometer of the attitudes of the ruling class? And what do these ups and downs mean for the vast majority of people who have nothing invested in this system? Go ahead, Nate.
Thanks, Nigel. There's a lot there, so please jump in if I rattle on for too long. So I think the first thing to take away from the record highs in the stock market is that the ruling class is doing pretty good, while 400,000 people have died in the United States in the past year. And that's a pretty extraordinary phenomenon. Why is that? Why would they be able to do so well in spite of the absolute disaster for working and oppressed people? And I want to give two answers relating to that. One has to do, and this is a general economic trend that has been the case for decades, with the productivity of labor. That these days, labor is so productive. A worker in the United States produces so much in 1 hour of work that the death of 400,000 people, mostly workers, is not really a big deal to the ruling class because they are not in desperate need of every single member of our class because the productivity of labor is so high. And this is one of the contradictions of capitalism, that on the one hand, all value is produced by labor. At the same time, the continuous development of the productive forces means that fewer and fewer laborers are required to produce the same amount. And so this has created a extraordinary situation in the past year where the ruling class has stood by and allowed 400,000 people to die and been okay with it. Another aspect of this has to do with speculation in the stock market. The Federal Reserve has been giving out enormous loans at basically zero or even negative interest. This enormous influx of money into the economy in the hands of the ruling class encourages massive speculation in the stock market, which can create the impression of large increases of value that are entirely illusory, but that certain members of the ruling class can nevertheless exploit to produce very, very real gains for themselves, gains that are ultimately carried by the working class. And that, I think, really brings us to GameStop, because as Nigel very clearly explained, the stocks that shot so far up and sunk one or two hedge funds are not going to stay up forever. In fact, they're already coming down, and that's because that was a speculative bubble. And whenever there's a speculative bubble, it's always the smallest investors who get in last who lose the most. And as and those are very often the maybe working people who, have got $500 in their savings and figure, hey, this is a place to put in that we can, make something of that. Again, as Nigel mentioned, the vast majority of investors in these speculative bubbles, and certainly the organizers who initiated them, are not members of the working class, but rather petty bourgeois and bourgeois people with tens of thousands of dollars of disposable income to invest in these schemes. I think, nevertheless, the fact that so many people rejoiced at the dissolution of a hedge fund says a lot about where the consciousness of working and oppressed people is in the United States and around the world. That people understand very deeply who their enemy is. That the people on Wall Street do not have their best interest in mind and are not on the same side. And then just lastly, to the question of what the ups and downs of the stock market mean for the vast majority of people. Well, the reality is they mean very, very little. Because the stock market goes up and down, and over the past few decades has consistently, over the long term, gone up. Yet the standard of living of working and oppressed people has been on the decline for decades in the United States. And of course, the most oppressed sections of our class feel that the most acutely. So I think to sum up, we have here a development that both exposes the absurdity of the stock market and the widespread disdain for the ruling class, but also shows the need for other methods of struggle that genuinely engage working and oppressed people in the fight against the ruling class. Thanks.
Thank you, Nate. A lot of excellent points in there. I'm reminded of that graph that's been getting shared more and more recently of productivity versus wages since the 70s, where productivity has gone up something like 200% and wages are more or less the same when adjusted for inflation. Do any of our other panelists have anything to address that series of questions, really?
Just a comment.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Capitalism today is so incredibly productive, and it's and so irrational. It's really beyond almost our ability to comprehend or measure. But I saw just this week a figure that really jumped out for me, that an Amazon worker, a dangerous job, especially during the pandemic, crowded, heavy labor, have to be able to lift 50-pound boxes, not just once, but all day, hour after hour, working a line, packing or driving, no job stability. What an Amazon worker earns in a year, Jeff Bezos earns in 1 second. Now, taking that a step further, in the time today's webinar will take, Jeff Bezos will earn more than all the 6,000 workers at the Bessemer plant in Alabama that are trying to organize a union. So you would think, why would Bezos, why would Amazon even contest? They have so much that will they even miss it? But they have so much because they understand that it's the labor that is the source of their wealth. So the figures are staggering, almost beyond our ability to comprehend numbers. That's the theft.
Thank you, Sarah. Does anyone else have anything? Larry or Martha? You're muted, Larry.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what my comrade said, even though Lenin wrote a pamphlet, Imperialism, a long time ago, more than 100 years ago, you can still read Lenin's Imperialism and get an idea of what's happening, and these day traders investing in these low-valued stocks and temporarily bringing up their prices more than 400%. But as Comrade Nate said, now they're down. What Lenin pointed out in this book is that as capitalism gets deeper and deeper into a state of decay, it's just another way of saying what both Comrade Nate and Comrade Sarah said. It can't fix overproduction. So the capitalist economy becomes more and more dominated by finance capital, which is to say worthless paper, because it doesn't mean anything. It's not a product that's made that, it's meaningless. And the economy becomes more and more like a gambling casino. And you get these huge bubbles. And I think Nate pointed this out, ever since the 2008 financial crisis, when the whole global financial system almost collapsed. It was like a near-death experience. Not only the US Federal Reserve, but the state banks of the other imperialist countries have been pumping literally trillions and trillions of dollars into the market, lowering interest rates. And so now Now everything associated with capitalism is a big bubble. It's never been bigger, and it's just waiting to bust and wreak havoc on people, on workers, on society, especially if there's no revolutionary struggle and revolutionary alternative to capitalism.
I'd like to add just a couple words to what everyone else has said, which I agree with all of it. See, there's kind of a misconception that if the stock market is roaring and stocks prices are climbing exponentially, that the whole economy is good and everyone's doing well. And even during the election campaign, Trump supporters will say, look, the stock market, it's the highest it's ever been. That proves the economy's doing well. And that's all because of this I hate to even say his name. You know who I mean. He gets all the credit for that. But the reality is that the rise in stock prices has nothing to do with the well-being of the vast majority of working class and oppressed people in this world. And in fact, when stock prices go up, it's because the stock buyers think they're going to make a lot of profit. Stock prices are a reflection of anticipated profits, and the more profits the capitalists make, the lower are the wages of the workers, because it's just math. The less they pay us, the more they keep for themselves in the form of profits. That's Marxist economics, according to the first Marxist economist, Karl Marx. It's exploitation. It's why there's no real peace between the working class and the capitalist class. Perhaps this misconception about a healthy stock market, meaning the economy's healthy for everyone, it may come from the flip side, which is when there's a crash in the stock market and the rich people lose a lot of money, then they will try to squeeze everything they can and recoup their losses as best they can from the hides of the working class. So when there's a crash, you will see mass unemployment, and you will see wages cut and services cut and austerity and all those attacks. But when it goes up, it doesn't mean that we get any of it back. We have to fight for every concession we can possibly wrest from the capitalist ruling class. And that ties into that critical struggle going on in Bessemer, Alabama, because they need a union so that they can have some kind of voice over the conditions of exploitation that they are suffering under, and some voice in how they are compensated for the labor power that they exert. And while we are absolutely in solidarity with that struggle, because of course we support their rights, but it has ramifications for this whole global working class. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Larry and Martha. Before we move on, I have a brief little plug here for the party. If you like this revolutionary Marxist analysis, if you're interested in joining a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist party in the belly of the beast, we encourage you to check out workers.org/join and join our party. Fill out the join form there, and an organizer will be in touch with you ASAP. All right, so moving on to the next question, which I'll address initially to Sarah. What are some of the past big speculative bubbles that brought on big capitalist crashes? Why do these happen, and what can we learn from these? You're muted, Sarah.
It's absolutely part of capitalism. It's impossible to have capitalism without it. It was Karl Marx who explained that all nations with a capitalist mode of production are periodically seized with a feverish attempt to make money without the mediation of the process of production. That's speculation. And that capitalism and wild, irrational speculation, it's like a raging fever. They go together. Now, historically, one of the first real wild speculative fevers was early in capitalism, what's called the Tulip Mania in 1637. So that's almost 400 years ago, the very birth of capitalism. There was a wild speculative market in tulip bulbs. It became a fashionable rage in Amsterdam, where one tulip bulb soared in value to more than $1 million in today's money. Now, the early capitalists buying the bulbs hadn't even seen them, didn't need it. They only thought it was so valuable because they could resell it at a fabulous profit. That's a financial bubble. When the price of something goes up and up and up, not because of its intrinsic value, but because people who buy it expect they're going to be able to sell it and make a profit. So Amsterdam in the 1600s, this was then the center of international commerce. The Bank of Amsterdam was set up in 1609, and it was a stock exchange. Why Amsterdam? Because in the 1500s, the Dutch peasants, the small craftspeople, the weavers, the smiths, were forcibly expropriated from the land and crafts and driven from their homes and turned literally into vagabonds, whipped and branded and tortured into the wage system. The same process happened in Britain, in England, 100 years later. Production for profit, for a capitalist market. It's not for immediate consumption. And it was absolutely a ruthless process. So 1600s in Amsterdam and Tulip Mania, how were the Dutch capitalists going to get out of this economic collapse? They began the traffic on a huge scale of the slave trade, really a form of colonial genocide. The Dutch sold 10 times as many slaves as the English in this period. Capitalist accumulation from the very first was built on slave trade, on genocide, on the expropriation of small peasants and indigenous people, on opium wars. That's what early capitalist accumulation is. And there have always been Robin Hoods that were promising to bring relief by leveling the playing field. Now, a whole series of other, really stock manias have preceded. One was called the South Sea Bubble. It's complete speculation in the 1720s. The Mississippi River Bubble, same thing. On investments that really didn't even exist. They were on paper, and yet they were wild speculation. What was called the railroad mania of the 1840s. There were wild gold and silver bubbles in government securities. There was, everyone knows the bull market of the roaring 20s. We should definitely mention the dot-com bubble which really burst in 2001 after the 1990s. There was this massive wave of speculation. And as a result, all these dot-com companies achieved, almost from the moment they were created, suddenly multi-billion-dollar valuations, and then they would crash. The one that really impacted working people to another harrowing level was the housing bubble of 2008. For a time before that, it cost less to buy a home than to rent. Interest rates were low. You were given money at closing. There were all kinds of incentives for people to buy. And they signed on to balloon mortgages. And in the crash, then millions of homes overnight lost a third of their value, sometimes even more. It meant they couldn't be refinanced. Millions lost their home in the housing bubble in 2008. And the one thing is, it's not just the rich investors. This is true, that the hedge funds today, these big speculators, they control pension funds of millions of state and municipal workers and auto workers. So in the dot-com and in the housing bubble in 2008, it really meant that some of the pensions in Michigan, the city of Detroit, and in California lost maybe a third of, they just chopped it. They said, well, the pension is worth less now. How outrageous is that? And it's why now, and Biden has been a supporter of this for years, they want Social Security. They want to take that money in Social Security and put it into the stock market. And it's a plan you'll hear again and again, how Social Security is going bankrupt and we got to have bigger returns and put it in the stock market. So really, Marx's contribution was always to explain to the workers how the system works, and that it always works against our interests, always. And it's a whole system based on wage theft and on wild speculation is parcel of the system. I just want to close this comment with a quote that is so powerful. It has so much to do with both the slave trade and with speculation and with the ruthless illegality of capitalism. Marx explained, with adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure employment anywhere. 20% certain will produce eagerness. 50% positive audacity. 100% profit will make it ready to trample all human laws. And 300%, there's not a crime at which it will scruple, not a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. And then Marx added as a footnote, if turbulence and strife will bring profit, it's freely encouraged. Smuggling and the slave trade have amply proved this. So this is the system that today still exists, but it has been constant crashes, wild ups and downs, and bubbles. And those bubbles are part of the system.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. Betsy in the chat added that speculation in fracking for natural gas and oil was part of what fueled the drop in the stock market in early 2020, which it's worth noting, especially now that Biden has said repeatedly that he will not ban fracking. Do any of our other panelists have anything to say about that last question?
Just bringing it up to date, after exploring, the crashes in the past that Comrade Sarah just did, you can even understand why the new President Biden and the Democratic Party is for pumping a significant amount of money, close to $2 trillion into the economy. Whether they'll do that and how that will help temporarily the unemployed and other workers who are suffering, well, we'll see how that goes. It's not enough, but we shouldn't be confused that the purpose behind this $2 trillion proposal is out of concern for the workers, for the unemployed, for the well-being and health of the working class. Actually, it's about trying to continue to prop up the capitalist economy. And the big thing that the government, Republican or Democrat, is worried about is the financial markets. Some economists They say this a little bit publicly. If you follow, the Financial Times, a little bit, the Wall Street Journal, and some of the other journals that the capitalists read, they think that what happened over the past 10 days with investors buying up GameStop and AMC and maybe one or two other very low-valued stocks could be a harbinger of something bigger to come, sooner or later, maybe sooner. There are some economists who even believe that because the bubble has been pumped up in so many ways that we talked about tonight, that the financial markets are so overvalued as to be utterly worthless, if not really hiding tens of trillions of dollars in debt. So back to, what the Democrats are proposing, when they inject this money into the system, and if they do it, it'll be temporary. A big part of it is to let Wall Street and let the big investors, the hedge funds and all of them that are really rich, the real rich parasites, let them see that there's some economic activity because they're worried that something negative could happen very soon. And that could be the trigger that bursts this bubble and brings the whole economy tumbling down on everybody's head.
All right, thank you, Larry. Nader, Martha?
Something real quick, unless Martha, would you like to go ahead?
Go ahead. I'll take the next question. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to address I noticed that you had asked, why do these bubbles happen? And I think that's worth going into a little bit, that, there's kind of two aspects to these crises. One is the question of speculation that Sarah had the great quote referring to, that when that the ruling class sometimes looks for ways to produce money that is not based on the production of any actual goods and services. And this is what speculation is, the idea of lots of money is pumped into a market that in and of itself will cause the value of the assets in that market to go up. And then once people identify that pattern, they can say, oh, well, I can manipulate this because if I get some money in there and then I can convince other people to put money in after me. And that's why you got that, what's that guy Kramer on those stock pushers on cable news telling you buy. And it's because what they're doing is making sure their ruling class buddies who got their money in yesterday can expect a better return. And so we see that this speculation allows the ruling class, some sections of it, to produce enormous profits that are immediately tied to the production of goods and services. Now, as Martha was mentioning, there's kind of a ratchet effect where when the stock market wins, the workers lose. And when the stock market loses, the workers also lose. And one reason for that is when, though, as Martha was saying, those the value of stocks is supposed to represent anticipated profits in some sense. And so even if it isn't today, at some point, those workers have to be squeegeed to get those profits. And that's usually what's happening during the crash. So there's a little temporal displacement. And just lastly, there's also this question of overproduction. I noticed a few of us mentioned that earlier, so I think it's worthwhile for maybe us to say, well, what is overproduction? Marxists use this term a lot. But because of the competitive process, members of the ruling class very often find that the way to increase their profits, to reduce their prices below their competitors, is to produce more, because economies for scale and new technologies, which require large investments, allow them to reduce their prices. This creates a problem, however, where the amount produced begins to exceed the need there is for any product or service in society as a whole. And then once that's exceeded, one of the companies producing that product or service is not going to turn a profit. And so then they're going to go bankrupt. They're going to lay off workers. And then that's going to spread throughout the economy from there in a domino effect. So this is a strange and very new thing about capitalism as opposed to previous modes of production, that you have economic crises that arise not from scarcity, not from there being not enough food or not enough housing, but economic crises that cause people to starve, cause people to be homeless, because there is too much food and there is too much housing. What an irrational system. What an irrational system that we now produce enough to meet everyone's needs, and yet millions, hundreds of millions of people every year suffer the most horrifying homelessness and hunger and lack of medical care, despite being surrounded by the most productive society ever created. And so I think that really speaks to the irrationality of capitalism. I'm sure if some of the other comrades here want to talk about overproduction, they can do it far more concisely and eloquently than I. But thanks.
Okay. Any other comrades have anything else before we move on? All right. So we have a plug for Sarah Flounder's book, which we previously mentioned. Many writers for Workers' World newspaper, as well as Ajamu Baraka, Mumia Abu Jamal, Vijay Prashad, Margaret Kimberly, Max Blumenthal, Lee Soo Hin, and Kevin Zeese have contributed to a new book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US. We now have a new book that you can buy. Our Durham branch will be having a book launch event on this book on February 16th, which you can find on Facebook at the page for Workers' World Party Durham branch. So our next pre-prepared question will be going to Martha. With such a desperate need for housing, new medicines, etc., and rebuilding infrastructure, why is money pouring into the stock market? Why isn't it being invested in things people need?
Well, that's such an essential question, because it affects all of humanity, really. We all have basic needs for shelter, clothing, food, medicine, clean drinking water, and culture and enjoyment and sleep, and so many things that we need. And so many needs go unmet under capitalism, which I think a lot of the comrades that spoke have pretty well explained how it works. But it's so irrational that we have to study economics from a working class standpoint to try to understand it, because at face value, it makes no sense. And it goes against our instincts as human beings, and it goes against the grain of most of human history. For almost all of human history, societies were classless societies. There was no working class, there was no capitalist, there was no master, nobody was enslaved, and human beings worked cooperatively. And that is our nature, if there's such a thing as human nature. So of course, it seems unnatural to anybody that billionaires are becoming centibillionaires and billion-dollar corporations are becoming trillion-dollar corporations, and the concentration of more and more wealth in fewer and fewer hands just keeps going on and on and on. And the poverty for most of the world keeps growing, and wages everywhere keep falling, and millions, people don't even have health insurance. How many people are homeless? But there is a genuine explanation for that, and that is just as ancient slavery was divided into an exploiting and an exploited class, and feudalism was divided into an exploiting and exploited class. And no one today would try to argue that these were humane systems. Everyone can say that slavery was a system of horrors, unspeakable horrors, and genocide. The same can be said about modern day capitalism. It is based on profit. It is not based on human needs. We say, it's a popular thing to put on a sign or say at a protest, people before profits. But people only come before profits when the whole system of profit taking and exploitation has been banished from the face of the earth. Capitalism is a system that is based on profit and not on human needs. And if human needs have to go unmet for the capitalist class to continue its profit taking, to continue on the wealth, to continue on the road to greater and greater wealth, that is how the system works. And the only solution is for the working class and oppressed of the world to take over the state, which is used to keep us down, to seize all the factories and the warehouses and the fields and the stores and all what we call, everything that we call the means of production. And we need to produce for human needs and not for wealth. And those needs are very much meetable, especially with the productivity of labor. We can meet the needs of the planet. We can save the planet from environmental destruction. All we have to do is be abolitionists towards capitalism, the way people 200 years ago were abolitionists towards slavery. Capitalism, which Marx called wage slavery. It's got to go. It cannot be fixed.
All right, thank you very much, Martha. That was very powerful. Any other panelists have anything to say about this third question? Larry, Sarah? Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
No, Larry. Okay. I want to make a point about capital is like pulled like a giant magnet or a vacuum or a suction pump. It will go to where it's going to earn the highest rate of profit. Can't be helped. And it's why it gets pulled into the stock market. It's why it gets pulled into speculation. And you could have a CEO that suddenly was enlightened, decided they were going to produce a needed product. And if it wasn't making a profit, a big profit, a super profit, then the investment money behind it would not be there. It doesn't matter what the intention is, even of a CEO or someone who says, I'm only going to invest my money in green. That money, once it's in the bank, it will go to where it can earn the highest rate of profit. And that is really also a very important, that's how capitalism functions, even against the will of individual capitalists. That CEO has to earn the maximum profit of that corporation every quarter, not just on a 5-year plan, every quarter. Otherwise, they're replaced. That's another important part. So they are driven to maximize profit at every point, not to do what is rational or needed in any way whatsoever. This is part of the irrationality, the criminal irrationality of this system.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Larry, Nate?
Just very briefly, there's very little profit in housing houseless people. There's very little profit in feeding the hungry. So the ruling class is okay with it. I mean, yeah, these goals are important to us as members of our class, and they're readily achievable, but they're just of no interest to the ruling class. And I think it's important, as Sarah pointed out, I think this is really important. This isn't a question of like the moral character of members of the ruling class, because the system compels capital to be invested in the most profitable way. So it doesn't matter if, one hedge funder wakes up one day and feels like he's got to do good in the world, or maybe if we just convince a bunch of hedge funders that we need to do good in the world, maybe if we convince Raytheon to not make bombs but to make vaccines. But guess what? There's lots of profit in bombs. And so it's the question is not a question of the moral character of the ruling class. It's a question of the balance of forces between the ruling class and the working and oppressed on the other side to seize back what is stolen from us every day that we go to work. Thank you.
There's a struggle going on in the ruling class. I'm not talking about the struggle between the capitalist parties here, or even the struggle over is fascism the way to save the system, or should we try something else? Although that's part of it. The struggle is between those in the capitalist ruling class who still want to hold on very much to the policy that has come to be known as neoliberalism, which is really just capitalism, hyped up to the 25th power, austerity, union busting policies that rapidly increase the pauperization of the working class everywhere, and channel all the wealth, more and more to a smaller and smaller percentage of those of us who share the planet. Some are saying, well, we have to stop neoliberalism. The pandemic has taught us a lesson. Some of them put it in terms of morality. There's so much economic inequality, and Black Lives Matter and so forth, which is we should not take serious coming from them, because that's phony. That's not where their heart is at. But what's significant about this struggle is that nobody wants to, do away with capitalism. That's not the issue. The issue is how to save it. And some of the economists and some of the ruling class asserting that, based on the experience that we've had, especially over the past year with the pandemic, and how that has exacerbated the global crisis of the capitalist system, we better do something Rooseveltian. We better do something, It's interesting, and I'm sure we'll all hear more about it and analyze it. But we know what will happen at the end. The end is not a mystery. Number one, as long as the capitalists insist on defending and holding on to capitalism, they're not going to be able to meet the needs of the masses, of the overwhelming majority of the people on the planet. They're just not going to be able to do it because that's inconsistent with the greedy profit motive that drives their system. So even if they try this or try that or talk this way or say that, we're reconsidering neoliberalism, they're not going to, they can't do it. They're addicts, and they go back to that which squeezes the workers to death so that the system can be saved. But it is a kind of, I guess, the handwriting on the wall to us, that the capitalists are now arguing over, Milton Friedman and neoliberalism. It's just another sign of how desperate they are and how deep this global crisis of capitalism is. The handwriting on the wall to us revolutionaries should be that at the same time the capitalists are arguing over the best way to save their system, we should be arguing with each other and more agreeing on the best way to end capitalism. Because both the need and the possibility of ending capitalism through revolutionary struggle, through organizing the working class, which is the only class that can do it, may not be as far off into the future as some of us have been thinking. We better start, taking this notion that it's way off, beyond the horizon, out of sight, and say, wait a second, maybe there's something coming up on the horizon. Let's be prepared for it.
All right. Thank you, Larry. So we've got another brief plug here. We are happy to announce that we have resumed printing hard copies of Workers' World newspaper again on a monthly basis, after temporarily suspending hard copy production due to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can subscribe to receive Workers' World newspaper by email as well at workers.org. We are also looking for donations to help us continue these webinars and our other activities. You can donate to us at Venmo at Workers' World, at our website at workers.org/donate, and on Patreon, which is our Patreon is at patreon.com/workersworldparty, or yeah, patreon.com/WWP rather. Our Patreon also supports subscriptions for hundreds of incarcerated workers who get our paper for free. So for the next question, we have one that someone posed in the chat. This is from Carlos Vasquez. Carlos writes, I'm a neophyte in Marxist economics, but I'm curious and want to learn more. Is there an equivalent to the stock market in Marxist economics? What do you think about cryptocurrency and its decentralized nature? Is modern monetary theory compatible with Marxist thought? And anyone can just jump in anytime.
Martha, I'd like to say a bit about the cryptocurrency question. Marx had a definition of money. That was that money is a commodity. Anything that is produced for exchange is a commodity, whether it's a chair or a fork or a car or a meal at a restaurant or any number of things. They become commodities when they are produced for sale so that the seller can make profit. Marx said that money was a special commodity in that money is a commodity that expresses the value of all other commodities. When he was writing, money was primarily, the form was primarily coins, gold coins, silver coins. Later, they were replaced with coins of lesser value, but they were backed up in gold. And then coins were replaced with paper money, but money was still the same kind of commodity. It was the same whether it was paper money or coins, or whether it's expressed in a bank statement. Money is currently not backed up with gold, but it's still that weird commodity that expresses value. Now we're seeing other forms of money, such as cryptocurrency, but ultimately they are still expressions of value. It is another form of money or currency used in the buying and selling of exchange values. And its existence does not alter the fundamental relationship between labor and capital, which is a relationship of exploitation by the ruling class of the working class. They are still getting richer and richer, and we are being left with less and less of the value that we produce, even as our productivity goes up and up and up with each new technological innovation, each new generation of robots, and all this new stuff. It needs a deeper analysis, but fundamentally, the most important thing is that it doesn't change the antagonistic relationship between the bosses and the rest of us.
Okay, if I could just interject real quickly, I had a response myself. I think cryptocurrencies, even more than being a currency, are a commodity that is purely based on speculation. They are the only value that they have is that they are intrinsically impossible to duplicate. The blockchain technology prevents them from being forged, essentially. But at this point, with several cryptocurrencies, most notably Bitcoin, they're achieving parity, where the amount of energy that it takes to produce these cryptocurrencies is exceeding the amount that they're actually worth. And then this again is only if someone will accept them for exchange with anything else, especially actual money, which remains to be seen. And as far as like a stock market under like a worker state or a Marxist economic system, I don't think that there would be any need. The counterposition of socialists and communists to the capitalist system is that production is centrally organized for specifically the needs of humanity rather than to produce profits. And the stock market is only there to facilitate profits through speculation on the production of commodities. But I'll let our other panelists respond if they have anything to say.
Lastly, to the last question, I just want to say briefly, as Marxists, we always say that workers produce all value, and that ultimately the labor of working people is the source of value. So there is no financial apparatus, there is no financial scheme or policy that can ultimately overcome that fact. There are some that can obscure it for some brief moment of time, but at the end of the day, the most important point is that the workers produce all value. And then just lastly about the stock market, because I see some other people putting things in the chat about it, that the whole idea of the stock market is that you're buying and selling fractions of all these companies. But if all the companies are collectively owned by the working class, administered through its government apparatuses, then there's no more buying and selling to be had. So under a socialist system where the means of production are, controlled by the working class and organized to meet people's needs instead of for profit, there's no role for a stock market because no one is buying or selling a section of, a company because we all own it all. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Nate. Does anyone else have anything to say on this question? Okay. We have one last pre-prepared question. Trump in Congress, and this one will go to Larry, by the way. Trump in Congress voted overwhelmingly for it, gave the wealthiest a huge tax break with a promise that then money would trickle down. Why doesn't it happen now? And I think this is referring to the stimulus package. What should we be demanding as a movement? Why do we need to fight for working class control of the productive forces and financial institutions? Go ahead, Larry.
Well, that may be referring to what Trump did the first thing he came into office in 2017, which was to give the capitalist class a multi-trillion-dollar tax break. It was the first thing he did. That didn't trickle down to anybody. That trickled into the pockets of the super rich and created a lot of debt that if nothing changes, it'll be on the backs of the workers and the oppressed to pay. The answer to part of that question is fairly obvious. We are going to have to, those of us who consider ourselves revolutionaries, socialists and communists, who are anti-capitalists, anti-racist, we are going to have to work hard to build a real working class fight back for the right to a job or an income. In the event that there are no jobs, then people should have an income. We're going to have to fight for the right to a roof over your head, a decent roof, to food, good food, to the best healthcare that modern technology can offer, which is what the rich have, socialism for the rich, and education, and all of these, and all the other things. Because even though we have lived through quite a long time, regardless of your age or generation, where these basic things have been under attack and could not be taken for granted because of the unique character of the severe global capitalist crisis today, made worse by the COVID pandemic. We have never, as a class, the overwhelming majority of the people on the planet, we have never been in such a dire and desperate situation where we'll have to fight and fight hard for the right to exist, because having these things is tantamount to the right to exist. So, comrades and friends, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for us to step forward. We must continue these important political and economic discussions. There are not enough of them, and more people need to embrace them and become more familiar with Marx and political economy and update it and apply it, not only learning the lessons of the past, but applying it to developments and the reality of today. At the same time, I think that there are a lot of revolutionaries of all generations, but I'm thinking mostly of revolutionaries of a younger generation. Political people hate capitalism. Maybe make it their business to come out to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations against the horrors of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all the other victims. And they want to make a difference. But there is a deep feeling of pessimism, a kind of a fatalism, a feeling of hopelessness that acts as a restraint on a lot of potential revolutionaries, giving the anti-capitalist struggle their all. Perhaps I'm wrong, but even if I'm half right, then we've identified an issue that needs to be talked about so that we can reverse it. We need more revolutionaries who know enough and feel enough to be optimistic and devote their life to making revolution in their lifetime. There's so many important struggles that are on the horizon. One of the comrades made reference to this brave organizing drive of Amazon workers in a little town called Bessemer, Alabama. They may win a union over the next 2 months. If they do, that's going to open up the biggest, transcontinental, capitalist corporation in the world, and the most powerful one, Amazon, to unionization. They've got almost 1 million workers if you add the 100,000 Whole Food workers, which is also owned by Amazon. What happens in Alabama over the next few months could spark the beginning of an organizing drive, a worker organizing drive that, as important as Amazon is, that would just be the beginning. It will transcend it, to organizing gig workers and migrant workers and all the workers, because our class, contrary to what some people say, is not shrinking. In fact, it's expanding. Every day, more people who used to think that they were in the middle class and maybe thought that because they had a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or something like that, secured their position in the middle class or even higher on up. They're waking up and finding out that they're in the working class, So we've got some important battles ahead to get the working class and the poor, the most oppressed, help get them ready for the revolutionary battles. So I'll end on that note. Bear that in mind. Dwell on that. We're not the first generation of potential revolutionaries to have to deal with pessimism and fatalism and hopelessness. There are other generations that confronted this and overcame it and did what they had to do. And I think now that to the extent that that's a challenge for us, we've got to take that challenge and beat it back so we can make the revolution that the world is waiting for. Help make it anyway.
All right, thank you very much, Larry. Couple of brief announcements. If you like this conversation and if you want to read more from Workers World, we have a ton of great books you can check out at workers.org/books, where you can read many of them for free. Also, if you are serious about taking the next steps to fight finance capitalism, to build socialism where workers control the economy, you have to join a party. We encourage you to learn more about joining us at workers.org/join. So I think we've gone a little bit over time. We have one more question that someone has addressed, and this one will be going to Martha. This is from Monica Moorhead. She asks, can someone explain why there is no kinder, gentler capitalism? Why can't individual capitalists be appealed to do the right thing by raising wages, providing housing, healthcare, food, education, and other basic needs? Why can't the ruling class control their crises? How has the early stages of capitalism that Lenin wrote about over 100 years ago evolved into monopoly capitalism? And I guess I would append to that, why can't the wealthiest country on the planet provide quick and easy vaccination for all of its citizens? Go ahead, Martha.
Well, that's a lot of questions. But as to why there can't be a kinder, gentler capitalism, that's the question for anyone that wants to address the lack of humanity under capitalism. Can we make it kind? Can we make it humane? And if we can, why get rid of it? Or are the contradictions so irreconcilable that the only resolution is through a socialist revolution? And we believe the second to be true. But it's an important question. And well, if it could be done, capitalism, as Sarah mentioned, capitalism goes back almost 400 years. And if it could be humane and kind, certainly it would have evolved in that direction by now. But it hasn't. It gets more and more destructive with our every breath, to the point that it has created a fossil fuel industry that threatens the existence of life on the planet. But as to why we can't make it work, it's a system based on profit and not on human needs. It's the essence of it. And the contradiction between these two big contending classes, it can't be resolved. And even without a foundation in Marxist economics, it's simple mathematics. The less they pay us, the more they keep for themselves. That's profit taking. That's the value that we create that we are not compensated for. I took the first question from Monica before we close. If someone wants to take another piece of that, really good question from Monica Moorhead, who's also a managing editor of Workers' World Party, who ran for president in 2016 and years prior, and is a great revolutionary that has been on these webinars many times. Thank you, Monica.
I'd like to jump from in terms of kinder and gentler, and now take this global pandemic and all the hundreds and hundreds of articles about the look for the vaccine. The vaccine as a cure would only be possible if Big Pharma could figure out a way to make it enormously profitable. And that is what Pfizer and Moderna have managed to do. They're talking about 60 to 80% return, profit return on the vaccines. And they've stretched it out. So most of us can't expect to actually get the vaccine for another year. So the disease, the virus continues to run rampant. Now, much simpler solutions were possible, particularly based on cooperation. But capitalism is not interested in that. And as a matter of fact, they fight it tooth and nail. And if they were interested in it in the least, there is a sickness that takes far more lives than COVID-19. And everyone knows the cure for it. And yet the cure is refused under capitalism. The disease is hunger. Hunger kills 9 million people a year on this planet. And everyone, even a baby, knows how to cure hunger. And yet, this system is absolutely able to solve world hunger. I mean, there's more than enough food than we could ever deal with. It's the very first thing that every socialist country deals with. Enough food for everyone. That is the first thing that's dealt with. And yet, under capitalism, it is never, ever dealt with. And as a matter of fact, it's growing. the number of people who die of hunger is growing. So we can't look to this system for a vaccine that really, they want to stretch it out. We just had a rally today, the Workers' Assembly Against Racism was so incredible, the way they addressed who doesn't get a vaccine and who does, even when it's provided by the government. Here's New York City, 60% people of color, Black and brown, and yet 11%, I think, are the figures that have access to, have received the vaccine in New York City. So racism comes into it in the worst ways, in terms of even what's sold around the world, and the access to it. The US, the EU will have access, but the people of Africa, the people of South Asia, Latin America, in terms of from big pharma, will not have access. And that's where the socialist world can really be the game changer. So there's a lot to discuss on this, but it is really the capitalist system that makes every problem impossible to solve, from hunger to COVID-19 to Amazon workers organizing. And it's why it's so important to support the organizing drives as they come up, as they happen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you to all of our panelists and all of our viewers who stuck with us here to the end. We're going to wrap up now. Next week, we will be having an important organizing meeting on Friday the 12th to support Alabama Amazon workers who are fighting for a union. For more information, follow our social media and our posts on workers.org. Build a workers' world. Good night, comrades.
Build a workers' world.
Workers' world.